Bauer, thank you so much for joining the INCON Learning session today. I'm going to introduce you to Alexis Kolak, and she is really a great learning specialist, education person, and technology. And I think it's such a good mix in this day and age. So I'm going to hand over to Alexis for the session on how your event KPIs determine your event technology. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Angela. Can you see my screen okay?
Perfect.
Always an important safety check. Thank you.
Perfect.
So thank you everybody for having me this morning. As Angela said, my name is Alexis. I'm with the Education and Learning Services team at Smithbucklin. I've been there for quite a few years, and I've actually been working on virtual events since 2009. So if you think you face some interesting technology struggles over the last few years, let's get together at a future IMEX, have a cup of coffee, and I'll tell you some very, very interesting stories. The purpose of today's session, as Angela mentioned, is to talk about event KPIs and how they impact the technology you select for a hybrid event. And this session came about as the Learning Month was being put together. I'm a member of the INCON technology team, and on one of our calls, Angela mentioned, don't you think it would be important for us to talk about the event technology that supports hybrids? I immediately started to talk, and that's how I ended up volunteered for this session. But I'm glad to be here because this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I'm going to get into our agenda in just a moment, but I want to start by setting the stage for everybody. And so I'm going to share an excerpt from a story that I really love. And I promise you, you are not experiencing a technology glitch. Your screen is about to go dark. So here's our story. At length, and with a wild desperation at heart, I quickly unclosed my eyes, and my worst thoughts then were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me, and the atmosphere was intolerably close. I lay still quietly and made effort to exercise my reason. Believe it or not, this is not a quote from an event planner's blog during the pandemic. This is, in fact, a quote from The Pit and the Pendulum, published by Edgar Allan Poe. And you might be wondering why I'm choosing to share Gothic novels with you during a webcast about hybrid technology. But I think for anybody who's produced a virtual event over the last 2 years, you can probably relate to this sense of unease, discomfort, the extreme amount of unknown, and the fear of reaching out into an undefined space to figure out what your next action might be. But if you're familiar with this story, you know that the protagonist essentially uses his reason to calm his mind, sets down a plan of action and priorities, and starts working towards how to escape the danger that he's in. And the reason I'm sharing this is because without an outcome in mind, panic can easily set in, and your course of action can lead you to the wrong conclusions and potentially some very dangerous situations. But if there's anything we've learned over the last 2 years, it's that if you identify a goal, it becomes that much easier to work towards it. So as we talk about working in the new space of hybrid technologies and what we're facing, remember as we move through today that identifying a goal and prioritizing your goals is key, and then making sure you have actionable measurement to move towards them is what gets you out of these really challenging situations. So the agenda for what I'd like to cover today includes defining what is a KPI, why they are so important before you begin planning your event, and then the types of measurements you might take, how those KPIs then determine some of the criteria for your virtual or hybrid event and affect your decisions around selecting and managing your event technology. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. Now I'm going to take us back in history a little bit to talk about why KPIs are so important. Prior to 2020, I think everybody here, if you were planning an in-person event, you had a standard set of measurements that you used to look at your event. Things like registration, sponsorship dollars, activity on your show floor. We had traditional KPIs for our metrics. In 2020, however, our paradigm shifted. And in the move to virtual, in our fear and concern in reaching into the unknown, we took what we already had and moved it into a virtual space. And while this saw us through that temporary hitch in our planning process, using in-person mindset and metrics definitely meant that some of the results that we received weren't what we were looking for. And we definitely identified that engagement in a virtual environment looks different than it does in person. We all started to adapt to this in 2021. We were intentionally moving our content online as opposed to lifting and shifting our in-person events. And while we did a better job of this because of that intentionality, the habit is still sometimes to use those in-person metrics to define your virtual event. And again, this leads to some mixed results in terms of what we're seeing. Now, the reason I want to paint the picture from a historical perspective is we're in 22 and it's a newer and brighter day. We have the opportunity now to continue to learn from all of these lessons and to potentially grow our opportunities online, as well as gather some valuable data for our in-person events. But the lesson of history here is that when we're moving forward without a goal that's defined specifically for the virtual or hybrid space, and we continue to apply in-person metrics, we're never really seeing the results that we want. So it's time to move forward and start to plan for the future as it exists right now. I always lecture my speakers in events not to read their slides to people. And so I promise you I'm not going to read everything that's on this slide, but this is some information from an organization. It's called KPI.org. You can look all of this up on the web. And the reason I want to share this is we need to start with a shared definition of what is a KPI. So a key performance indicator is a critical indicator of progress towards an intended result. There's three big aspects to that. The first is the rate of change. So it's that progress measurement. Then we have the specific measurement, and you're going to see that measurement comes up a lot here. And this is a defined shared measurement across all groups, and then it's moving towards an intended result. When you're looking at a KPI for an event, you're not just looking at a measurement, you have to have all three of these components. So if you think about a standard measurement you might have for an in-person event, you might look at your registration. Saying we have this many registrants is a measurement. Saying we would like to grow our registration is an indicator of progress, but it's that intended result that's really the interesting part, right? So if we say I want to grow registration 5% from where it was last year, growth is the indication of progress. 5% over last year is the measurement, and then the result is missing there. You need a because clause. I want to grow my registration 5% over last year because I would like my event to be more profitable. I would like to include new audiences. We think there's a bigger ecosystem than what we're currently seeing in the event. This is really critical as we're talking about hybrid events, because we've never really had the chance to sit down and talk about what is the result that we're expecting from these events and to get clarity around what that looks like. I'm going to shift into storytelling mode again, and I'm going to mention why KPIs come first. It's very easy to look at the measurements that are available to us and the metrics within an event and to set those as our course. But if you simply set a destination based on the measurements you're giving, you might not end up in a place that you want to be. So when we talk about setting key performance indicators for an event, we want to make sure that they fulfill a couple of key needs. They need to align with our organizational strategy. They need to create a common vision of success, and they need to provide us with the opportunity for proactive course correction. When we talk about alignment with organizational strategy, this could be areas like financial health, alignment with our brand, fulfillment of strategic goals. So we're really making sure that our event is not standalone. It fits into the broader picture of what we're doing within our organization or what our clients are trying to do with their events. You might think that a KPI is very clear and everybody is going to be on the same page, but a lot of people will view the same metric very, very differently if the measurement is not defined in very specific terms. A great example of this is a group decides to launch a computer and they are going to install a spell check in their document program, and everybody says spell check is obvious. And then they launch it and nobody is happy because somebody thought spell check would include grammar functionality. And someone thought it would be using British spelling of words and instead it uses American spelling of words, or it doesn't include things like syntax or the ability to include characters. But you just said spell check and everybody thought they knew what spell check was. So as you're looking at defining your performance indicators, you want to make sure that they include specific measurements, that they are not a single point in time, but they include a series of dates and deadlines that you're going to meet, milestones for your progress, and that you're considering the tools that will be available to you as to how you will take these measurements. Course correction is, I think, one of the unsung values of KPIs. You have the chance, if you know what your measurements are, to be proactive and not just reactive. Nobody likes to be 3 weeks out from their event date, sit down in a team meeting and talk about the fact that registration is down and what can we do about it. But if you only have a final measurement, this is typically where you end up. So having that designated set of milestones and benchmarks that you want to hit allows you to say, we're getting close to our first measurement, we're not where we want to be in order to hit our final goal and to see the result that we want to see out of that. And so here's where we're going to make an adjustment. I do have a secret measurement here, and it's ironic because it's scope creep. And if you have ever participated in the development of a virtual event, you know that you've been well into the planning progress, and someone will come to you and say, could we add this? Couldn't we do this? It's online. We have the ability to flex and change. If you have clear definitions of success for your event and measurement, this is a great way to prevent this kind of scope creep from happening and detracting from the areas that you really need to focus on. So I would encourage you to keep your KPIs front and center in all of your discussions around your event, and especially for those events that happen online, because there does tend to be the impression that because things are online, change is very, very easy, and it's simple to expand. I like to liken a virtual or hybrid event to looking at having an in-person event in a conference center and how they're very, very different. If I plan an in-person event and I'm going to a convention center, I know the dimensions of the walls, I know where the outlets are, I know where the teams are that work in that space. When you construct a virtual event or even a hybrid event that's borrowing from in-person content, you are building the convention center. You're laying the electrical. You're building the walls. You're responsible for all of the directionals and navigation, and things that people assume are easy because they are online actually require a great deal of forethought and planning. So use your KPIs as a benchmark to say, is this new addition going to move us towards the intended goal for this event? Or is it something that someone had a great idea for and we should consider in next year's planning? The types of measurements or indicators that you might use for a virtual or hybrid event, and I'm going to use those terms interchangeably here because even though a hybrid relies on in-person content, it is distinct and separate from your in-person event. So the types of measurements that you look at for virtual and hybrid events have some similarities with your in-person events, but they can also be somewhat different. I've got some buckets here of the types of KPIs that you might be developing to look at your event. And it's not a specific list, again, because you have to define your own measurements within the goals or the success indicators of your organization, but I do want to give some examples. So for things like financial goals, you might not just want to measure the revenue that you targeted or whether or not you're on budget, but instead look at things like profit margin and what does the profit or revenue from your event have to support throughout the rest of your year. When you're talking about attendance at the event, you're not necessarily talking about just a number of people, you're talking about what you're going to do with that number. So that might be a sales pipeline, it might be lead gen, it might be membership generation. And so you need to consider how many people you need to get into the beginning of that funnel, how often those are moving forward based on what you've seen in other places, and are there priority audiences that you would like to target? You can have an event and have a target of 5,000 people and get 6,000 people there. But if the additional 1,000 people who are coming are not the audience that's going to help you grow or help your organization grow or be the appropriate customers for your product, is that really a success metric? Audience engagement and satisfaction is very, very different in a virtual event than it is in person. And the way that we perceive it is different. So we have to set different kinds of metrics. That being said, you still want to tie back to your organizational standards like your Net Promoter Score and looking at factors like customer and member loyalty. But the way that you will measure that will be different than simply surveys or attendance at a particular event. You're also going to be able to track all of the metrics for in-session attendance, on-demand views. You want to take a much more holistic approach to those audience engagement scales. And then you also have partner considerations, brand recognition. But I want to touch on the last point here, which is future planning. Virtual and hybrid events are an absolute goldmine of data in terms of what your audience is doing. And you can learn things from a virtual event that you can't track at an in-person. So for example, I can look at what people are clicking on in the agenda and the sessions that they consider attending but don't, or how often they participate and view a particular session, or if there's any kind of continuity in the types of sessions that they are engaging in. And that's very, very hard to track at an in-person event. So some of my KPIs for my event might not just be tied to what I intend to achieve with this event, but again, going back to that organizational strategy, what can I learn that will potentially take me forward in other avenues and allow me to adapt this event, have new offerings within my organization or my client's organization, or potentially put down programs that are not as successful as I was hoping they would be in order to rework those resources and time and effort and dollars into something more efficient. So anytime you're looking at the KPIs for these events, Again, we're talking about the rate of change, we're talking about the specific measurement, we're talking about the goal that they achieve, and it's not just numbers on a page. They're numbers that are moving us towards a specific outcome. I know everybody's hoping that I'm going to put up a chart with the top 10 KPIs that you should be using for your virtual event. And I'm just going to tell you right now that that is not anywhere in this slide deck because there is no ideal set or number of KPIs. In fact, this is my favorite answer to give to almost any question I get. And the answer to what are the right KPIs for an event are, it depends. Because it depends on your goals. It depends on the larger ecosystem of your organization or your client's organization. And so rather than giving you a specific list and having them not be the metrics that will work for you, I'm going to share a couple of questions I think you can ask to determine what are the right KPIs. You've heard me say this a few times, but the best place to start is, what are your goals for your event? What is this event meant to achieve for your organization, your customer's organization? What is it meant to achieve for your stakeholders? And once you have that end goal, you can work your way backwards from your starting point to that finishing point and say, how will I know if I'm getting there? What data will I need to determine if I'm meeting my goal? So how am I going to measure that rate of change, and what are the tools that are available to me to do that within my event platform? It's great to say that this is my end goal and this is my current state, but if I don't have a way to set those little roadmaps along the way and to, again, make sure that everyone is in agreement that we're measuring success the same way, I'm not going to have a very strong KPI. It is important to consider, beyond your own measurements, what your key stakeholders are going to ask you for. So there are the KPIs that you're going to measure against, and then there's what other people will consider. And this could be things like your sponsors for your event and the data that they're going to be looking for. It could be other sections of your organization who are looking at how this fits into the broader strategy. It could be your board or your executive committee or your executive leadership that's going to want this information for their purposes as well. And then remember that there is also the layer underneath. There's the team that's executing on this event, that's measuring their own performance and what they're trying to help achieve. And are you measuring things that are going to help them make sure that every stage of the process is on track? And then finally, will I use this information beyond my event? This is the future planning piece. So I need to make sure that my event achieves its current goals. But if you've had a virtual event in the past 2 years, you've probably had somebody come to you afterwards and start asking for things like statistics, demographics, how many post-show views did we see for this? So consider how you could extend the shelf life of what you're doing into the broader context of your organization. I've touched a lot on KPIs in a general sense, and I've mentioned some places where there are unique hybrid and virtual considerations, but I do want to take a moment just to focus on this since it is the goal of today's presentation. And so here are some unique considerations for hybrid events. I'm going to get on my soapbox for a minute and tell you that your hybrid event is not an extension of your in-person event. It is a separate event. It has separate goals and separate measurements, even if you are using the content that is happening on site. And that means that you need to tell a separate story for your hybrid event. It's fine if you want to treat your virtual or your hybrid and your in-person event as a duology, and each one of them is their own book and they are related, but hybrid is not a chapter in the in-person story. And so when you're considering how you're going to measure the success of this event, you do need to have a slightly separate set of goals that you can relate back to your in-person event. There is a unique opportunity here in terms of data and measurements that you have not been able to take at your in-person event. And so simply carrying over your in-person metrics is missing an opportunity to expand your visibility into what's actually growing or changing within your organization. Additionally, there are some metrics that you use on site that are not going to be as effective in a virtual platform. So you don't simply want to carry in-person metrics into that hybrid setting. Make sure that you're considering what tools are available to you and what you're trying to achieve. Your hybrid event, unlike your in-person event, lives online for a very, very long time. And so long after you have packed up your registration counter and your exhibitors have taken their booths back to the FedEx counter and all of your attendees have gone home and unpacked their swag bags, your hybrid event lives in its on-demand content. And so you have to continue your measurement and plan your measurements to extend beyond the live event. One of the things that I hear the most about virtual and hybrid formats is how much attendees appreciate the opportunity to have access to on-demand content. And this is twofold. One is that they may be attending a live session and miss another session that's happening concurrently. And so they get the chance to amplify the number of sessions that they get to attend and to extend that benefit. The more common reason that people bring this up, though, is that life tends to interfere when you're attending an event online. And we don't always have control of our surroundings the way that we do at an in-person event. So that on-demand access, when your kids aren't asking for help with their homework, when your boss isn't sticking his head into your office and asking you if you have a minute while you're clearly working on something, and while your commute is taking place and you're stuck on a train, all of these things factor in. And when you consider a global audience, time zones make this even more imperative. So as you plan for your measurement of your hybrid event, remember to plan for the full life cycle and not just for the live dates. And this is a little bit of an iteration of some of the previous points, but make sure that what you're measuring is not just a measurement of this year, it's a measurement for the opportunity for growth in future years, whether that's for your specific hybrid event or things that you may even want to incorporate in your in-person. Especially looking at where attendees are focusing their time can have an impact on how you are planning your agenda and programming, both for your hybrid as well as the in-person event that it is tied to. So I've talked a lot about KPIs. I'm going to try not to use that acronym anymore. I'm really going to try to talk more about technology at this point for you and how the selection of your metrics impacts your technological decisions. It's important to have your measurements because that's how you will then define your technology needs and clearly articulate them to the vendors that you're going to consider. It will help to determine the budget that's available for that technology support. And it will also help your on-site team figure out what they need to provide you in support of that virtual event. So once you've got your definition of success, you can build your budget, you can build your timeline, and then you can begin your outreach to your technology partners. Now, you probably already have technology partners that you've worked with over the last 2 years, and I'm not suggesting in any way that you have to move away from them, but the technology space for virtual has both grown and shrunk through mergers and acquisitions over this last year. And so the technology you were using last year might be a little bit different this year, have a few different faces associated with it. It's probably a good idea anytime you are considering having a hybrid event that you go back and take a slightly larger look at the landscape and potentially put out an RFP to look for technology partners. The same way that you would consider this for your on-site AV team, your decorator, anything that would be under your control there. Your selection process should include representation from all of the teams that will support your hybrid event. It's tempting to have 1 or 2 people go in and kind of bite the bullet and work through this process, but you need to make sure you have input from all of the teams that will either have an input into the event or have an outcome that they'll take away from it. And that includes your marketing teams, your content planning teams, sales and sponsorship, if you have a membership team, even your in-person logistics team, because they will be impacted by the decisions that you make. Your IT team is a critical component of this, but I do want to issue a caveat that you should not assume that your IT team is the ideal team to be making the selection for you in terms of virtual platform. IT is going to bring a really important visibility into your current technology ecosystem and what systems you may need to integrate with and how complicated that's going to be, as well as security considerations for platform selection. But the user experience side of things, the sponsorship fulfillment, the designation of where your audiences are going to be, that's expertise that lies in other areas of your team. And you need to make sure that that is leveraged and included and that all of those voices are in the room as you're making these selections. You can use your KPIs to develop your RFP. And I would also recommend that you include that as a section in your RFP as you reach out to partners to say, this is our goal for this event. This is how we're planning to measure this. Please talk to me about how you would help us achieve this goal. And then if you're getting responses that have standard answers and say, we have measurement tools and reporting, as opposed to here's how other organizations have measured this change, here's how we would work with you to define the correct reporting and the setup components for this, you may want to then take that RFP with a grain of salt. I think there are a lot of people over the last 2 years who've planned an online event have signed on for what looks like a very fancy platform with a whole lot of reporting, and then have sort of found themselves out on their own without a lot of guidance about the best way to use the tools within the platform to make sure that they were on track, without a lot of guidance around which features you may not want to use because they'll be a distraction. So by including your goals in your RFP, you're making sure that you're identifying a technology partner that not only can provide the tools to support you in that aspect, they can provide the customer support and relationship to help you achieve that end goal and not leaving it to you to figure out. Your KPIs can also help to drive an evaluation scorecard for technology. So once you identify those 2 to 4 partners where you want to take a look at the platform, you can bring your team in for those demos and give everybody a shared set of measurements that they're using to evaluate these platforms. This does 2 things. It prevents you from being distracted by what I like to think of as shiny objects. So features in the platform that look really, really great and interesting, but weren't necessarily one of your priorities as you planned for a virtual event. And it allows everyone in the room to have an equal voice in the decision. If you've been on a call, some people ask a lot of questions. I'm known for taking over these kinds of demos. And then you have other people who are going to sit back quietly and take in feedback and make their own estimation of what's happening. But you need to gather all of those voices and all of their input into these decisions. And a scorecard where everyone can provide their feedback on the same items within the platform will then allow you to make sure that you're representing the needs of everyone involved. It will also help you to structure the demo to make sure that it is successful and focuses on the areas that are going to matter to you and to your team, as opposed to the features that the vendor may feel are the most interesting or valuable in their platform. Again, it's all about guiding that discussion towards your measurement of success. And then a nitty-gritty detail here, I strongly encourage you to review the reporting available in the platform. And not that reports are available, but the specific way that those reports will be delivered to you. Either if you can get a demo of them during that discussion with the partner, or if you can get a sample set. Because again, this comes back to the measurement tool that you'll use to hit that KPI. There are platforms that will say that they can measure session attendance or time in session. But if you have CEU reporting requirements, the way that that information needs to be delivered to you may be very, very specific, and you may need to see individual rows for every time someone enters and exits a session. Not every platform does that. So make sure that you're getting a copy of that, or you're getting visibility into the exact output so that you know that the benchmarks that you've set down, the milestones that you need to hit, and the specific measurements you need to take to achieve your end goal are things that your platform can support, or that you'll have time to work on custom reporting with your vendor. It doesn't have to be a deal breaker if the report doesn't exist, but you do need to account for the time and labor that will go into finding a way to identify and achieve the appropriate data to hit that metric. I'm going to go back to the KPIs that I mentioned earlier and dig into what this means in the hybrid context that we've talked about. So for things like financial, there is sometimes a temptation to look at certain platforms as too expensive. But remember that cheap doesn't guarantee profit margin. It can potentially mean an enormous amount of manual work on the part of your team, and that's not really a cost saver at all. It also opens the door to a lot of potential for manual accidents. Humans are typically the main cause of errors in technology. It's not the platform itself. So make sure that you're considering, again, what are you trying to achieve, and are you going to provide the appropriate user experience to justify the cost for attendees? Do you have the appropriate tools to help advance the sales pipeline, and not just to measure lead gen, but to move people down that funnel? Do you have the tools to measure engagement in a way that's going to be relevant to you and help you make decisions about future events, member loyalty, and future outreach? And do you have the appropriate tools for your partners, especially if you are going to have involvement in the event? Providing measurements for your partners that will allow them to have self-management tools as opposed to waiting for you to report on data is critical, because they need to be acting on that data in real time during the event. Brand recognition is probably the easiest form of measurement to look at in the event because it's some of the clearest data, but you need to make sure that the outputs that you're receiving are in alignment with your larger strategy for your year-round brand and PR. And then, of course, what can you glean from the reports that are available to influence future planning? A lot of what I've covered up till this point has talked about how to plan ahead of the event and how to make selections before you get started. But KPIs don't go away the minute that you start actually working on your event. They're actually even more influential, and they're important to consider throughout the planning process. KPIs will help you to steer your virtual ship. And I'm going to have a little bit of an analogy here to finish off with, so humor me with this. You wouldn't get on a boat without an understanding of where your final destination is. You wouldn't try to plan for the supplies for that journey and the manpower that you're going to need without an understanding of how long that journey is going to be and how much of each of those supplies and resources you're going to need to successfully achieve your end goal. And you wouldn't try to navigate to your end destination without the tools to make sure that you are accurately traveling along your path. You wouldn't leave without navigational charts, measurements for longitude and latitude. Maybe a compass would be really, really nice. KPIs provide these same tools for your virtual ship. They make sure that you are on track and moving towards the appropriate goals. You have measurements that are allowing everyone to ensure that you have alignment on your current state and the opportunity for course correction, and they prevent you from getting distracted by other items that may come up along the way, but are not critical to your measurements for success. You should also be able, within a reasonable boundary, to report on your progress towards all of your KPIs at any given point. So if you've only set an end measurement as your goal, it's going to be very, very hard to report on progress. Remember that the goal is to get your ship into safe harbor, and the best way to do that is to plan for a safe journey and to have the tools that you need available to course correct and get back on the right track. This is most of what I have for you today, but we do have some time if there are questions, and I did see a question come into the chat here. So I am going to open things up if that's okay with you, Angela.
Yeah, fire ahead, Alexis, yeah.
Okay, great. So I see there's a question from Cecilia. What if we have two opposite KPIs? So we want to ensure customer satisfaction, which requires extra costs of interpretation, but we have to control the budget. That's a great question, Cecilia. I think the important part of this is the priority of your goals, right? When you have KPIs, we tend to set down a list of them, and then we tend to put things on the end, like it's a grocery list, and we're just going to continue to add on to that because we're making a trip to the grocery store. But it's not a bulleted list when we talk about KPIs. We are talking about priority. And so if you've been given instructions or a goal to manage the financials of that event and to stay within a certain budget boundary, but you're also being told to add things like interpretation, you have to say, will achieving the interpretation goal contribute to the larger financial goal of the event? And which one of those is a higher priority? So let's assume that the budget goal came in first and then somebody added interpretation. If you look at adding interpretation, does that raise the number of people who are going to register for the event? Does it raise your revenue to the point where it offsets the additional cost? And where is that tipping point between those two? It's possible that both of those KPIs can exist in harmony because one helps to advance the other. But if you find that adding translation or adding interpretation services is not going to necessarily grow your budget margin, then you need to have an internal discussion with your team about which of these is going to be the priority. That also happens if somebody brings up a new goal that they want to add to the list. You go back and you put it in the priority order of your current KPIs and determine if it pushes anything off the list. The only exception here would be if you have a consideration for something like, if you're mentioning interpretation, in the US, we have the American with Disabilities Act, where we have to provide reasonable accommodation. If someone requests something like an interpreter, and that's essentially, that is a KPI that exceeds everything else that's out there on our list. But that's a long answer to your question to say those two can exist. You need to determine if movement on one will help to advance the other. And if they are diametrically opposed, have a discussion with the team about which of those is going to take priority, and then adjust the KPIs to fit with each other. Are there other questions? I have something that I didn't get to fit in my slides that I'll mention quickly. I mentioned stakeholder KPIs. An important one for consideration, especially in the virtual and hybrid space, is when you talk about sponsors and partners. Anybody here who worked on a virtual exhibit hall over the last 2 years might have had some experience with what we think the right KPIs are for that space versus how our partners feel about them at the end. This comes back again to adjusting the scale and scope of those KPIs and what the appropriate measurement is for success in a virtual environment. It's also a matter of coaching your partners on how to look at those measurements in advance of giving them the statistics. So rather than having partners sign up and then get their click-throughs and their leads and finding out that they're not happy with that number, you may need to talk to them about a reasonable expectation and also the difference in the value of the leads that they're receiving from your virtual platform and the ability to interact with those leads in real time as opposed to what they would have for their on-site experience. So you're not necessarily going to set the measurement or the indicator for them, but you can offer them some advice on how to use the data they are going to receive and what a metric for success would look like with that information so that they're not disappointed afterwards. Not everybody is going to take your advice on this, but a little bit of coaching about the data that you're going to give them and how to use it can go a long way in setting the appropriate expectation and also maybe improving their satisfaction with the event. I think that's everything I had for today, Angela, unless there are other questions.
Thanks, Alexis. That was really wonderful. Anybody has anything, any queries? I think you've stunned everybody, Alexis.
Talk pretty fast. Hopefully that wasn't part of the issue.
No, I think so much really interesting information. I'm sure people will bring a lot away with them on that one. Okay, so no more questions? No. Oh, I think maybe Lisa.
Yes, Alexa. Thanks for the very lots of interesting information. The thing I'm thinking now, actually the question I want to ask is for the KPIs. Do you set more ambitious KPI, or your clients ask for more ambitious KPIs before COVID, because we have audience online, so they maybe want more ambitious KPIs to us?
Yes, I think there was a belief as we started online that has somewhat continued, that because we're online, more people can attend, we have larger audiences, and it comes back again to this idea of we're online, and so there's not some of the associated costs. And some of those can be considered stretch goals. They might be very, very ambitious. I think when you're talking about a KPI, you want that to be something you are confident that you can hit with the tools that you have available to you. And if you're being pushed to set a metric that you think is out of bounds, then you may need to walk through an exercise to talk about how you reached that assumption and what the factors are in that. So if somebody's pushing you, for example, to grow your registration by 20%, where are they getting that 20% from? What do they hope to achieve by getting 20% growth in registration versus 10%? And what are the factors that contribute to that? The sky's kind of the limit in the virtual space. It's the opposite of where I started, because some people are very nervous and some people view it as a huge opportunity, and it's a little bit of both. But if you have a discussion about what's creating that specific measurement and what is going to be required to drive to it, I think that can help to rein things in a little bit. And if you're still getting pushback there, I would ask for the reasonable measurement with the acknowledgement that we also have a stretch goal on top of that we are all actively working towards. But this is the minimum that we need to hit to have a successful event, and everything on top of that is added value. Does that help?
Okay, so talking about the tools, what kind of technology tools you used now in the States? Because in China, sometimes we are some of the companies, they are push us to use the AI to do the marketing, to the digital marketing, and they said that's maybe more helpful to focus on the audience, the very exact audience that you can target. Yeah,
this is another great benefit of online, is the ability to personalize. Now that comes with caveats, because I think sometimes we hear the term AI get thrown out there and everybody gets excited because computers are going to figure things out for us. And I tend to joke internally that computers have logic, but they're not logical. A computer isn't going to go out and figure out who the appropriate audiences are for you. And an algorithm is not going to say, this is who you should be targeting. When we use AI, we're inputting a question essentially, or we're typically we're actually making an assumption or a hypothesis to say, I think that there's room for me to grow in this audience. And now I'm going to use technology tools to measure if I try to target this audience using these keywords or these spaces, do I see the result that I'm looking for? So you do have to remember when you're using AI that you are putting in the assumptions and then the computer is working off of those assumptions to achieve an optimal result, but it's not going to target them for you. And if you're going to use targeting, you're going to need to set priority audiences. And I did have this on a slide, but not all audiences are created equal. There are certain attendees for your event, whether it's in person or online, that are ultimately more valuable to you. They may be longer term customers. They may have a longer history of purchase with you, or based on the scale of the company, the opportunity for growth for members. They may be from member organizations that have the opportunity to participate at a much higher level with you. And they may also further the goals of the organization. If it's a particular research space, you may be looking to grow the presence of physicians, or to grow a particular kind of researcher, or to add an international audience that's not contributing to the conversation. But you are going to pick a top set of audiences to personalize for, and then everybody else is still going to get that generic message. And it doesn't mean that you don't want them at the event. It just means that they are not going to advance your goals as much as those other audiences are. And sometimes people think that this is unfair, but if you have those priority audiences and you do achieve their presence at the event, typically that helps to improve the quality and the scale and the budget of the event for everybody else too. So if you want to use those tools, we do have personalization here as far as marketing and how you target the content within the event and what the follow-up looks like, but you are going to have to choose a very specific set of prioritized audiences to be able to use those tools, and you're going to input how you would define them.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
Violet mentioned the metaverse. I really enjoyed Twitter here the day that people started talking about the metaverse and all of the ways that we think the metaverse is going to look. And somebody went back in history, I think 5 or 10 years, and pulled up an example of what some companies were calling the metaverse in this space. And there are VR and AR tools out there now for virtual events that are absolutely fascinating. They can be used to great effect. They can also be a very shiny object that can be distracting. So if somebody starts to talk about the metaverse, or how do we incorporate these more virtual landscapes and ecosystems, it comes back to, what is your goal for that? What is the goal that your organization is trying to achieve that your current tools and offerings aren't fulfilling for you? And then how do we work backwards from that and compare, would VR help to fill this gap? Would more communication and engagement and year-round activity fill this gap? Is there an opportunity for partners to help? And put all of the different options there and start with the goal and not the technology. When we start with the technology, we make it fit, and we assume that because we turn something on, attendees will go there. We all assumed if we turned on one-to-one meetings and interviews and virtual chats, attendees would go in there. Some of them did, most of them didn't, because it was about us wanting them to be in the tool and not what their goal as a stakeholder in the event was for using that space. So if somebody brings you the metaverse, ask what they're hoping to achieve, and remind them that it's pretty big. Now, that being said, I have seen some events where, I'm not going to call it metaverse, but having a really holistic virtual environment has been important to them from a brand perception. So it's not to say that there's not a role for this kind of thing, for really immersive kinds of events. There absolutely is, as long as it's tied to one of the measurements, which is probably your brand and perception in the industry. Great question.
Thanks, Alexis. I think we've covered all the questions now, folks, right? Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us today, Alexis.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm sure people will be asking and thinking many questions in this regard in the future. So
it would be great to continue the conversation.
Yeah, indeed. And today you are closing our INCON Learning for 2022. So I think it was a very nice session to close off with. And I'm sure we'll be picking your brains next year and see where we are on this space of virtual and hybrid and in-person meetings. It'll be interesting to see that. So thanks, everybody. And for your colleagues, we will have the recordings of all the INCON learning sessions on the INCON website over the next couple of days. We already have about half of them on there, so feel free to take a look. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.